What was it like to create an iconic TV moment? Well, that's nice.
It was the very first thing we thought about when we were approaching that series, is how it would end, which we wanted to do the final problem, and we wanted to kill off Sherlock Holmes, and not cheat like Doyle did by having him die off stage, as it were, but to actually kill him and have him die in Watson's arms in a way that you would believe was actually him dead, and then flip it on his back and say, no, he's not dead at all, and we're not going to tell you how he did it yet.
If there is a unifying idea to Series 3, it's Sherlock returns to London and life has moved on. He doesn't ever think it will, but life has moved on without him. And if there's a sort of continuing idea that runs through it all, is real life sort of flows around him. You see, one of the advantages of bringing Sherlock into the modern day, it's, in a way, it's less about the time travel, it's more about him seeing our world and trying to deal with it, sort of dealing with real life. So I think there are more moments of Sherlock Holmes versus what real life is like this year than there have been before.
A lot of the beginnings of our conversations are sort of, what would Sherlock do in this situation? And that's kind of fun. It's a bit like, putting Mr. Spock into a domestic situation. It's immediately funny, but also how would he handle, being John's best man, which is what he does in episode 2, things like that. So,
and he's such a fully formed character that these ideas spring up at you. You just think, I was a kid when I first thought about the fact that it must have been the case that Sherlock Holmes must have been Dr. Watson's best man. And what was that like? It must have been charming yet ridiculous. It must have been so wonderful.
And now we know.
Yes.
But it is, for the third series, we realised we'd done the 3 biggest ones, and there was an obvious dramatic momentum with bringing him back from the grave, and we also knew we wanted to bring in Mrs. Watson, which is what Conan Doyle had done. So it's not a spoiler. So there was a sort of form arrived quite quickly, but then we had to decide where we'd go with that and which stories to sort of tackle, really. Well, I think the big thing for a third series is to take it on. We wanted to develop it. In fact, there is a thing in the original stories. You do get a little frustrated when Dr. Watson still says, I know you're going to say I'm an idiot, Holmes, but I just don't see how you did it. And you think, really, now? Now? After all these years? So we sort of know we've got to find new people to be impressed by Sherlock's trick. John, of course, has become a bit, he's not blasé, but he knows what's going on. Equally, we want to make Sherlock grow as a person. He's getting better at it. Those little things we had from the beginning where he sort of says, is that a bit not good? No, and he's sort of being morally guided. That doesn't mean he's become soft or he's become like everybody else, because he'll never do that. But it's fun, isn't it?
It's impossible to portray a genius who doesn't learn. I think if he's a genius who didn't learn to better his ways, that would look stupid. Sherlock Holmes in the original stories begins quite terrifyingly, as ours did. And he doesn't soften, he just gets better at interacting with people. He actually genuinely makes friends with people. It's a small number of people he would count as friends, but he does actually properly have relationships with other human beings and all that. So I think seeing him progress is vital to Sherlock Holmes, otherwise you don't think he's a genius. Geniuses do learn, and he must. But in some ways, as you'll see in this series, increasingly, sometimes his greater talent, his greater aptitude for dealing with human beings can make him worse than ever.
And then for John as well, equally, when we first joined them, he was a lost soul, and Sherlock kind of gives him back his mojo, and he comes to understand that that's what he needs. I think that he's never going to settle for a quiet domestic life in general practice. So they just complement each other. The really big new element in the third series is Amanda Abington playing Mary Morstan. And that's been such a delight. She's so brilliant, but it's just the right thing for a third series. I think you bring in a new element which doesn't sort of choke the baby out with the bathwater, but just makes you reassess things. As we were saying, by putting Sherlock in a different element, he's suddenly not quite sure of his ground anymore, where he stands. Lars Mikkelsen is a stunning actor. And the nicest man. He's just a delight to be around. But he's brought a really interesting new thing to the show. We've talked about doing Charles Augustus Milverton for quite a long time. He's a really big, proper brilliantly realised baddie, the master blackmailer. Or in the original title of the story, The Worst Man in London.
Was that the original title?
Yeah, isn't that great?
It also allowed us to move the character on in a strange way,
Yeah.
because he was just Charles Augustus Milford in the first draft. But you think, well, like, now he's obviously Danish, so he became Charles Augustus Magnuson. And somehow what we always do on Sherlock is take the original and just move it around slightly, just change it slightly, because everything should be slightly different in this alternate universe version of Sherlock Holmes, where it all happened now as opposed to back then. But I think he's an outstanding villain. He will give you proper chills. You will shrivel at times.
And it's also a great new way to go, because he is essentially a man to whom power is second nature, and he's not a baddie in his own mind. So it's a fascinating new place to go. He doesn't, it's a very different thing to Moriarty.
It's also, I think there's and that was the key thing in the story, is it's the only time you actually, we talk about Sherlock Holmes falling in love, he doesn't hate many people either, but he hates Charles Augustus Milverton in the original story. He talks about it with an intensity of disgust and loathing that I don't think is echoed anywhere else in the stories. So to actually write about, why our Sherlock hates this man so much. He doesn't hate Moriarty at all. I mean, he fights him, he beats him, he's probably happy that he's dead, but he doesn't hate him, but he hates Magnuson, properly hates him.